little bit more about just your own testimony. You came to Christ in the 70s, in the Jesus revolution, the Jesus movement, the Jesus people. There's kind of a lot of that stuff, those types of lingo. Just kind of give us who you are and how you came to Christ and kind of your relationship with that and Calvary Chapel and all the rest.
Sure, happy to do so. That was really a unique time in history because the East was beginning to come west with self-realization. And prior to that, modernity still held in front of us the idea that through research, investigation, and so on, we could find the truth and live by it. And I can remember Josh McDowell, the apologist, scheduled a talk at San Diego State University on whether or not the resurrection of Christ was actual history or a hoax.
Wow.
And it literally filled the auditorium.
Wow. People
still thought it was possible to find the truth, and they were interested in finding the truth. And then 2 years later, he did a talk on what God says about sex. Again, standing room only in that auditorium. And so that was one of the big differences between the late 60s and early 70s and our present era, because since then, postmodernism has declared war on absolute truth. In fact, we could say that postmodernism is very, very hostile to absolute truth, rejecting anything which we would describe as a totalizing worldview, a totalizing meta-narrative, a meta-narrative being a totalizing worldview that's true for everyone.
Right.
And so postmodernism eventually gave us not just relativism, but cultural relativism, that truth is simply a perception relative to a culture, and you're trapped in your culture. And so who are you to comment on someone else's truth?
Right.
And so if Josh McDowell had scheduled either of those talks at San Diego State today, he'd be lucky to get 12 people.
Without much protest, probably there'd be lots of, even if there were a lot of people, there'd probably be tons of protests, right? And yelling hate and this, and you're intolerant, you're a bigot, and everything else. Yeah,
exactly. So many things were converging in the late 60s. Not only the East coming west with the Beatles and other situations, but also a desire to reject the values of our parents and embrace this hippie bohemian lifestyle where I've got to be true to myself. I need self-discovery. Nothing should stand in the way of my self-expression. And so in many ways, not only was Eastern mysticism contributing to that, but also the drug culture and also psychology. And so one of the things that fired the sexual revolution was not only the birth control pill, that women should be able to have the same experimentations without the consequences as men, but another thing that fired the sexual revolution was two sets of researchers, Kinsey and Masters and Johnson. And so both of these researchers were saying that human sexual activity is a matter of mental and physical health. And so they divorced it from morality. And so, and now picture the hippie movement saying, well, let's find ourselves, discover ourselves, throw off everything, including our clothes, and we will somehow find ourselves. This is part of self-realization. I can remember attending sensitivity meetings where people just got together to be real and then try to form close relationships based upon just spilling your guts. And more often than not, those things turned into people just running off and having immorality. So at that particular time in history, the late 60s, I was on the beach quite a bit, working out, sustaining my lifestyle as a waiter manager in a restaurant. And at that particular time, I also would visit Calvary Chapel and listen to Chuck Smith from time to time. And sometimes I would go to the miracle service led by Lonnie Frisbee, which also took place on the same campus. And at that particular event, led by Lonnie Frisbee, is a much smaller auditorium. And you expected to hear about healings and people standing up and waving their hands, saying they're healed. And And then there was a service afterwards on how to speak in tongues. And they would, anybody that came forward, they would sort of jumpstart you by having you say la, 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 da, da, da. And then hopefully that would trigger the tongues. And so one of the things that really stood out in that time frame is an epistemology of experience, that things were validated by experience. And I was attending Long Beach State University, and almost every day there was some type of protest and demonstration against napalm in Vietnam, against certain conservative hawks who were senators and so on, demonstrations in favor of drugs. In fact, it's shocking. The school administration invited Timothy Leary to speak to the students, and he was commending taking drugs in order to tune in and then drop out of culture and then tune in to oneself.
Tell the audience who Timothy Leary is. I'm not sure who that is.
Timothy Leary was one of the main philosophies of the hippie movement, philosophers of the hippie movement. Very educated man who was a proponent of psychedelics, a proponent of psychedelic drugs.
Gotcha.
So think of some of the things that were converging here, Richard. Not only did you have the Cold War and Vietnam War, but also it just seemed like these rock stars, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Jefferson Airplane, each one of these groups was generating a new hit every few days. And so this whole hippie movement had the music to go with it. The music helped fire the philosophy.
Interesting.
And so these folks who were drafted to go to Vietnam, they brought that music with them. And it's such a strange juxtaposition to be around so much death and at the same time be listening to the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. And yet that was a common experience over there. So in my personal situation, I was unsaved, living a very pagan lifestyle. I'd experimented with being a member of a fraternity when I was at the university. And all they really did was have parties and boast about their athleticism. Most of the men in this fraternity were varsity football players at this university. I was one of the smaller men, even at 6 feet. And so, but our dues went to one main thing, and that was to buy kegs for parties. And so
a worthy cause.
I finally left that fraternity, and the Lord brought some difficulty into my life. I had an unhealthy lifestyle of working at this restaurant and drinking and not really going to sleep until 2 a.m. And so I began to get chronic tonsillitis. And then my girlfriend was raped at gunpoint. And then I was drafted to go to Vietnam. And so all these things happened at once. The Lord was using that to shake me up. And I remember I really wanted to know the answers to these things, but I didn't want to abandon my lifestyle. And so I brought my girlfriend to Laguna Beach one afternoon, and we're sitting on the blanket, and someone came down with a spear for spear fishing. And he had the rubber tubing next to it that you can pull the spear back and actually use your hand grip to make the spear fire with the rubber tubing. There's no mechanics at all. Your hand, holds the rubber tubing back, and then you can let the spear go. So I asked him to demonstrate it for my girlfriend. And so he said, "Oh yeah, well, I'll shoot at this sand dune and watch how the spear flies." And so he showed how it was done. And I said, "Well, that's really great." He goes, "Yeah, I just happen to be down here." He says, "I live across the street, and anytime I want, I can pretty much go down here and get a lobster for the evening. That's how many are around this rock." And he said, "I'm a pastor, and I always bring my Bible wherever I go." Now, the sun was down now. It was dusk. And I said to him, "Well, I've got a Bible on the towel here." He goes, "What?" I said, "Yeah, I've got a Bible on the towel here." And so I handed it to him, and he began to share with us what it means to know Christ. And really significant situation that I just happened to have my Bible with me, totally unsaved. And he began sharing the gospel. So it seemed like everywhere I went, I'd run into someone who wanted to share the gospel with me in front of grocery stores, no matter where I was.
Wow.
And so I decided that, and I broke up with this girlfriend because she began to be utterly committed to the Baha'i movement, something she'd learned while she was in Hawaii. She came back from Hawaii and was committed to the Baha'i movement. And even experiencing that awful rape did not change her faith in Baha'u'llah, the supposedly the prophet of the Baha'i movement. So I really wanted to know where I stood with God. And so I began to read the Bible more often, but I didn't change my lifestyle of sin. And so as it turned out, I heard that the gentleman who had developed all of the supplements and vitamins and nutrients for the European health spas was a new Christian. Somehow I found that out. And so I asked a friend of mine, can you get me an appointment with that guy? Can you possibly get me an appointment with that guy? Because I want to work in the nutritional division. And by the way, I changed jobs. I was a weightlifting instructor for Jack LaLanne gyms at that time. So,
Jack LaLanne, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to get out of the instructor business and into the nutrition business because that's really where my heart was.